to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Yes, that isn't our usual musical intro. It's Volker Bertelmann's overture to the movie Conclave, which I finally saw and really enjoyed. The film was both a financial and critical success. It received 8 Academy Award nominations, including for Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Supporting Actress, and 1 for Best Adapted Screenplay. Despite its church trappings, Conclave most reminded me of a 1964 film, The Best Man, even more than it did a 1968 movie, The Shoes of the Fisherman, which also features a papal conclave. The Best Man takes place during the national convention of an unnamed political party to nominate a candidate for the U.S. presidency. Both films are well-acted and well-directed dramas about the corruption, personal ambition, scheming, and infighting underlying elections that are supposed to be about choosing the best man. One might expect that in a film about American politics, especially one written by Gore Vidal. Not so much about a papal election, unless, of course, you have studied the history of the medieval Catholic Church. My initial reaction after watching Conclave was to credit it for laying out the theological divisions within the current Roman Catholic Church, though I also thought that it drew its ideological good guys, the church liberals, and its bad guy, a cardinal who is more reactionary than traditionalist, a bit too broadly. Although film critics love Conclave, it has a 93% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes based on 318 critical reviews. Conservative Catholics are less enthused. They've accused the movie of distorting canon law, slandering Pope Benedict XVI, and generally being anti-Catholic, anti-religion, and thoroughly woke. They are particularly upset by the twist ending, which I won't spoil for those who haven't seen the movie, though one of my friends said that the ending nearly spoiled the movie for her. Like I said, I enjoyed the film. It's worth watching. Conclave is about a contentious election of a new pope. It begins with the death of a liberal pope clearly modeled on the current Pope Francis, and the holding of a conclave to elect a successor. The conclave is organized by the Dean of the College of Cardinals, wonderfully played by Ralph Fiennes, a good man who is beset by inner doubts. Once the movie's 113 cardinals have assembled, they are sequestered in the Sistine Chapel, where they are cut off from any outside influences and, ideally, from all outside information. The movie never explains what the word conclave actually means or how and why the papal conclave electoral procedure began. That omission inspired this episode. The term conclave is derived from a Latin phrase, clausi cum clave, which means enclosed with a key. It refers to the type of election portrayed in the movie, one in which a group of electors are locked together in a room until they can come to a consensus. As regular listeners of this podcast are aware, I have so far posted the first 2 episodes of a 3-part series on the development of the medieval papacy to the year 1215. Because papal conclaves were not introduced until 1274, I thought I would take a slight detour and devote a short episode specifically to that subject. My usual go-to co-host, my wife Ellen, is not a moviegoer, and I'm too good of a husband to force her to watch movies with me, so this will be one of my rare solo efforts. I'll begin with the story of the last papal election not to involve a conclave. That was the election of one of the least likely men to become pope, the hermit and Saint Pietro di Moroni, who took the papal name Celestine V. In July of 1294, a delegation of 3 cardinals and a multitude of monks and priests trekked into the wilderness of Mount Maiella in central Italy, bearing an incredibly unlikely offer for this saintly hermit. Their mission was to persuade him to accept his election as pope. There was a measure of desperation in this. On the 4th of April in the year 1292, Pope Nicholas IV died. He himself had become pope after the Holy See had sat vacant for 11 months because of divisions within the College of Cardinals. Matters, if anything, had worsened since. 12 cardinals, reduced to 11 after one of them died, had been arguing on and off, mainly off, for 27 months over a successor to Pope Nicholas IV. Family rivalries among the cardinals, who represented the leading noble clans of Rome and the Papal States, was a major stumbling block. The College of Cardinals in the movie Conclave numbers 113, who represent Catholicism around the globe. The College of Cardinals in the 13th century rarely exceeded a dozen. These men all knew each other very, very well. They had deep rivalries and deep friendships, which made consensus among even this small number difficult to achieve. The cardinals and papal curia in 1294 must have been experiencing a serious case of déjà vu. This was a repeat of what had happened in the previous papal election, but on steroids. Back then, Cardinal Jerome Massi, who took the papal name Nicholas IV, had been elected in large part because he was a dark horse. Unlike the other cardinals, he did not belong to one of Rome's great families, and that is probably what helped make him acceptable to the rival factions. It helped that when all the other cardinals had fled Rome because of an outbreak of malaria, he had stayed behind to tend to business. Massi was a pious Franciscan monk and, ironically, probably the only cardinal who really did not want to be pope. He refused the results of the first unanimous election, and it took a week of lobbying in the second unanimous election to change his mind. As I said, the situation was worse when Pope Nicholas IV died. The cardinals were hopelessly divided by familial and international rivalries. 3 of the 11 cardinals belonged to the Orsini family. 2 others belonged to the Colonna family, and each faction was dead set against the other elevating their favorite candidate to the papal throne. The rivalry between the Orsinis and Colonnas had an international dimension to it. The families were on opposing sides of an international conflict over the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily, claimed by both the Spanish kings of Aragon and the French counts of Anjou and Provence, a cadet branch of the ruling Capetian dynasty of France. To explain that, I'm going to have to make a short dive into some international medieval politics featuring the papacy. In 1266, Pope Clement IV had recognized Charles I of Anjou as King of Sicily and of the Regno. The Regno is all of southern Italy extending north of Naples. It would later become the Kingdom of Naples. The Pope could do so because Sicily and the Regno were legally feudal fiefs held from the papacy. This was because of a deal that popes in the late 11th and 12th centuries had made with the Norman adventurers who had conquered these lands from the Lombards and the Muslims. In return for conferring legitimacy upon their conquests, these highly successful Norman adventurers, Robert Guiscard, his brother Roger I, and Roger's son Roger II, did homage to the Pope and pledged their loyalty in the papacy's ongoing conflict with the Holy Roman Empire. In 1194, matters changed radically and not for the better for the papacy when a Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, deposed the last Norman king of Sicily and claimed the throne for himself in the name of his Norman wife. To say that this made the papacy uneasy is an understatement. Holy Roman emperors of the 11th and 12th centuries had in practice been little more than kings of Germany. The Hohenstaufen emperors Frederick I Barbarossa, Henry VI, and Frederick II had greater ambitions. They viewed themselves as successors of the Roman emperors of antiquity and pursued a policy of imposing direct rule over Italy and Sicily. This threatened the papacy's rule over Rome and the Papal States. Pope Alexander III had joined with the city-states of the Lombard League in a war against Frederick Barbarossa. Their common goal was to maintain self-rule. Henry VI's accession to the throne of Sicily and Naples raised the ante for the papacy. It raised the specter of the Papal States being encircled by Hohenstaufen rule in both the north and the south. This became a real possibility when the Emperor Frederick II, who had grown up in Sicily and imposed an imperial-style rule over it, renewed his grandfather's goal of uniting all of Italy under his direct rule. Once again, the papacy joined with the city-states of northern Italy to oppose him militarily. Frederick II, one of the most remarkable kings of the Middle Ages, came close to succeeding. Despite being repeatedly excommunicated by popes, even once when he was on crusade, and also being deposed by popes, and having an anti-king set up in Germany to challenge him, and even having a crusade launched against him, nonetheless, Frederick II managed to beat back the combined forces opposing him. His death in 1250, however, sounded the death knell for Hohenstaufen imperial ambitions. Frederick II's war with the papacy had been costly. To pay for it, he had imposed harsh taxes on his Sicilian and Italian subjects. His death was greeted with an unsuccessful revolt in Sicily and a more successful revolt in northern Italy. His one legitimate son, Conrad IV, succeeded him on the thrones of Germany, Italy, Sicily, and Jerusalem, but was never crowned emperor. This was the beginning of an imperial interregnum that would last until 1273, when Rudolf of Habsburg was elected to a much weakened office. Upon Conrad's death in 1254, he was succeeded by a 2-year-old son, but Frederick II's bastard son, Manfred, who had been regent of Sicily under his brother, took advantage of a false rumor of his young nephew's death to name himself King of Sicily. In doing so, he ignored the papacy's claim to feudal overlordship, which earned him excommunication and a papal bull nullifying his coronation. Manfred followed this up by securing the support of Florence and other Tuscan city-states, and by marrying off his daughter Constance to King Peter III of Aragon. Pope Urban IV responded by launching a military invasion of southern Italy, and Manfred answered with an army drawn, get this, from his Saracen subjects. When the papal invasion failed, Urban II turned for support north of the Alps. He first offered the throne to Edmund of Lancaster, King Henry III of England's second son. But when the English indicated that they were unwilling to wage war against Manfred in order to obtain that throne, the Pope turned to the French. In the year 1262, Pope Urban IV offered the throne of Sicily and Naples to Charles I of Anjou, Count of Provence, the younger brother of King Louis IX of France, that is, Saint Louis. After 3 years of warfare and with the death of Manfred in battle, Urban IV's successor, Pope Clement IV, was able to crown Charles I King of Sicily. But Charles's and his son, Charles II's, harsh rule and heavy taxes alienated the native Sicilians. Popular discontent in Sicily came to a head on Easter Monday in the year 1282, just prior to the start of the evening vespers at the Church of the Holy Spirit in Palermo. A riot broke out between Angevin soldiers and the Sicilian population. What sparked it is unclear. Some sources say it began with the harassment of a Sicilian woman by an Angevin soldier, others with an attack by a French soldier on a Sicilian burgher or a priest. The accounts on what caused the riot differ. What is certain is that what began as a riot grew into a full-scale popular revolt against the French. As King Charles II gathered forces in Naples to recover his rebellious province, the rebels turned for support to King Peter III of Aragon, who, as I said, had a claim to the throne of Sicily by right of his Hohenstaufen wife. The result was the War of the Sicilian Vespers, which included an unsuccessful crusade launched by the papacy against the Kingdom of Aragon. All of this was still going on when Pope Nicholas IV died in 1292, and that added an international factor to the election of a new pope. The Orsini cardinals were pro-Angevin. The Colonna cardinals were supporters of King James II of Aragon. Rumor had it that their support had been purchased. That's perhaps the only similarity with the movie Conclave. With the Orsini and the Colonna dead set opposed to allowing the other side to win, and all the other cardinals lining up behind one or the other factions, no cardinal could reach the 2/3 majority needed for an election. Political instability in Rome led to social disorder. Pilgrims to the city were being mugged, and the homes of the wealthy and even some churches were being pillaged. Meanwhile, King James II, son of Peter III, King James II of Aragon, and Charles II of Naples were on the verge of coming to a final agreement. James II, despite winning several naval battles in the Western Mediterranean and land victories in Provence, decided that the war was just too costly to continue and was willing to give up his claim to the throne of Sicily. But the two monarchs needed the approval of a pope to ratify their treaty. In March of 1294, Charles II of Naples met with the cardinals and lectured them about the need to elect a pope. But when a vote was taken, the College of Cardinals remained obstinately deadlocked. What broke the logjam was a letter from the saintly hermit Pietro de Morone. In it, Pietro recounted a vision he had had in which God told him that cardinals would be punished if they did not elect a pope very, very soon. That prompted one of the cardinals to rise up and nominate Pietro. As a complete outsider, Pietro belonged to neither faction. That he wasn't a cardinal was unusual, but not without precedent. No one could challenge his piety. His competence to be pope? Probably, but not his spiritual worthiness. In his favor was also his age. At 82, he wouldn't be pope for all that long. He was not only a dark horse, but he was an interim choice until either the Colonna or the Orsini could shore up enough support to get one of their own elected. Pietro de Morone might have thought twice before sending the cardinals his letter if he knew what it would lead to. He was exactly what he purported to be, a holy hermit who sought communion with God in solitude. Many years earlier, Pietro had abandoned the life of a Benedictine monk, which he had found far too lax and too secular, for a life of solitary prayer in the wilderness, first at Mount Morone, and later, when his fame started to attract unwanted followers, to Mount Mayella. He took for his model John the Baptist. Like John, he wore a hair shirt roughened with knots. As if that wasn't sufficient, he wrapped a chain of iron around his body, and he fasted every day except for Sunday. When the delegation of cardinals arrived at his hermitage, they told the startled hermit that he had been unanimously elected pope and begged him to accept the office. Like his predecessor, Nicholas IV, Pietro at first refused. Finally, after prayer and at the urging of the delegation, he reluctantly accepted. Who was he thought, to deny the will of God? He chose the papal name Celestine V, and his pontificate turned out exactly as one might have predicted from a pope present in body, but often communing in private with his God. Celestine V was the last pope chosen outside of a conclave. And that brings us to what a papal conclave was and how it functioned. The hiatus between the pontificates of Nicholas IV and Celestine V was actually only the second longest. The election of Pope Gregory X in 1271 had taken 3 years due to infighting among the cardinals. As a result, Pope Gregory X at the Council of Lyon in 1274 issued the papal bull Ubi Periculum, and that established the papal conclave. Papal elections had never been easy, except perhaps in the earliest centuries of the institution. Canon law required that the Bishop of Rome, like his fellow bishops, be elected by a clergy of his diocese with the approval of surrounding bishops, one of whom would consecrate him to his see. In the late 6th and 7th centuries, the election of popes required the approval of the Byzantine emperor, as the Duchy of Rome belonged to the Eastern Empire. In the late 8th and 9th centuries, the Carolingian rulers of the Frankish Empire became the patrons and, to some extent, the masters of the papacy. Then, when the Carolingian Empire disintegrated at the end of the 9th century, the papacy came under the control of the local nobility of Rome and the Papal States. At one point, a secular ruler of Rome appointed 4 consecutive popes, the last being his 20-year-old son. After King Otto I of Germany became Roman emperor in 962, elections were subject to the approval of the Ottonian and then Salian dynasties of Germany. German emperors would nominate a candidate who would then be dutifully elected by the clergy of Rome. This changed in the year 1059 when Pope Nicholas II issued the papal bull In Nomine Domini. The bull established a new electoral procedure for popes, placing the selection of the pope solely in the hands of the cardinals. The election of a new pope by the cardinals was to be confirmed by the emperor, but not as a matter of right, but as a privilege conferred upon the emperor by the papacy. The historical context for Nicholas II's papal electoral bull is important. Nicholas II, like his predecessors and successors, was part of a movement to reform the morals of the Catholic clergy. This was the so-called Gregorian Reform. This movement had been launched by a super-pious German king and Roman emperor Henry III, and it was carried out by his hand-picked German pope, Pope Leo IX. But Henry III was now dead, and his 9-year-old son ruled Germany only in name. In the absence of an imperial protector, the papacy and its reform program were threatened by the dominant political powers within Rome and the Papal States. That was the Tusculan family. Upon news of the death of Pope Stephen IX in 1058, the Tusculan faction engineered a coup against the reformers. Taking military control of the city of Rome, they placed one of their own on the papal throne. This was the anti-pope, Stephen IX. The reformers in the Roman Curia sought support from Godfrey, Duke of Lorraine and Spoleto, and the Marquis of Tuscany, and from the Empress Agnes in Germany. They then elected the Archbishop of Florence as Pope, Nicholas II. The electoral decree of 1059 was directed less against the right of approbation of the papacy claimed by the German kings as Roman emperors than against the threat of the local Roman nobility that saw the vacuum of power in Germany as an opportunity to regain their control over the Holy See. Unsurprisingly, the German kings did not surrender their control over the papacy without a fight. When King Henry IV of Germany came of age and became embroiled in the so-called investiture controversy with Pope Gregory VII, he responded by appointing an anti-pope who, with German military support, drove Gregory out of Rome. Henry IV's son, Henry V, also appointed an anti-pope, and his grandson, the Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, appointed 4 anti-popes before he gave in and accepted Pope Alexander III as the rightful pope. By the middle of the 13th century, the papacy had freed itself from the control of the Holy Roman emperors. But that, as we've seen, did not mean that papal elections necessarily went smoothly. In the absence of imperial authority over the nomination process, popes could be freely elected by the College of Cardinals. But the College of Cardinals in the second half of the 13th century was hardly a harmonious body. Pope Alexander III's decree that the election of a pope requires a 2/3 majority vote by the cardinals exacerbated the situation and almost guaranteed extended elections. Pope Gregory X's bull, Ubi Periculum, issued at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, was meant to bring order to the electoral process and to prevent future extended sede vacantes, the technical term for vacancies in the Holy See. Ubi Periculum required that papal elections be held by the cardinals in complete isolation from the outside world and outside influences. And that is essentially what a papal conclave is. The practice itself wasn't new. According to Professor Joel Rolla Costa, 5 of the 9 papal elections between 1198 and 1271 had been held in seclusion, either by choice of the cardinals, as happened in 1198, or by compulsion, as occurred in 1241. The 1241 election occurred while Rome was under blockade by the Emperor Frederick II. The secular authorities of Rome were anxious for a quick papal election so that they could better deal with Frederick. The problem was that the 10 cardinals present in Rome, 2 other cardinals were being held prisoner by Frederick, that those 10 cardinals were divided between those who wanted to continue the late pope's hostility toward the emperor and those who wanted to improve relations with Frederick. To facilitate a decision, the Roman senator Matteo Orsini, the dominant political force then in Rome, ordered the cardinals to be locked into a dilapidated palace, the Septus Solium, where they were to be given restricted rations to speed up the process. This was new for a papal election, but it followed practices common among the city-state republics of northern Italy. In the well-recorded election of a podesta, that is, the governing magistrate, for the commune of Piacenza in 1223, the 8 electors were locked in a room for 3 days without any food or drink. So the conclave procedure for elections was neither new nor radical in 1274. What was new is that Ubi Periculum established a set papal electoral procedure based on those practiced in the northern Italian communes. The procedure was as follows. 10 days after the death of a pope, The cardinal electors were to meet at the papal palace in which the Pope and his entourage were residing at the time of his death. The cardinals were then to be enclosed without any communication to the outside world in a single large room of that papal palace, each accompanied by one, or if the cardinal was ill, not more than 2 servants. That room would then be locked with a key, which is literally what conclave means. After 3 days, the cardinals would be allowed only 1 dish at each meal. After 8 days, they would be allowed only bread, wine, and water. In short, the cardinals were to be starved into consensus. Pope Gregory X's bull was met with enthusiasm by the gathered clergy at the Second Council of Lyon, with the noticeable exception of one key group, the cardinals. The next 2 papal elections followed the procedures laid out in Ubi Periculum, but the hardships endured by the cardinals during the election of 1276, that took place during the sweltering heat of a Roman summer, convinced the successful candidate, Pope Hadrian V, that a different process for elections was required. On the day after his election, Hadrian assembled the cardinals in the Lateran Palace and announced that he was suspending Ubi Periculum, quote, on account of its many intolerable and obscure provisions, end quote, and promised to replace it with something better, a promise he never fulfilled. The conclave apparently had taken a toll on the Pope-elect. He died a few weeks later before he could even be consecrated. His successor, Pope John XXI, issued a bull confirming the revocation of Ubi Periculum. With the exception of the speedy election of Pope Honorius IV in 1285, papal elections took between 6 and 11 months. That is, until the 2.5-year-long sede vacante following the death of Pope Nicholas IV, which is where this episode began and where we will end. Pope Celestine V was the last pope to be chosen outside of a conclave. As I said, he viewed the administrative duties of the head of a hierarchical institutional Catholic Church as an unwelcome interruption from his daily routine of abstinence and prayer. He finally ended up doing the unthinkable, resigning the office of pope. But before he did, on the urging of the cardinals, who now thought better of their resistance to Ubi Periculum, he reinstated Gregory X's edict, and popes to this day are still elected by a college of cardinals in conclave, though they are no longer starved into submission and consensus. Just as a side note, my wife Ellen reminded me that I myself was once involved in a conclave election, or at least a conclave selection. Years ago, I was asked to participate as a civilian academic representative in the selection of what's called a permanent military professor at the United States Naval Academy. The selection process is the same as used for military promotions. It involved being bussed down to the Navy's Bureau of Personnel in Millington, Tennessee, and then being locked in with the other members of the selection committee in what's called a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, without our cell phones or any contact with the outside world until we finish the selection. But fortunately, that only took a couple of hours, and I think that if it had gone longer, the Navy would have sent in food. But maybe not. Well, that's it for this episode, but I hope that you will join Ellen and me for the concluding episode to our 3-part series on the development of the papal monarchy. That should be coming out in a couple of weeks. Until then, bye for now.